Senator Paul.
Thank you, Professor Kerr and the Federalist Society. There's always some danger to a physician talking to a bunch of lawyers, particularly if I try to tread on your turf and tell you something about what you think you may already know more about than I do, which is very possible. But I'm also interested in provoking people a little bit to think. And so the introduction by the Federalist Society says the Federalist Society, we're for judicial restraint. And I think the topics become maybe a little more complicated than it once was, what that actually means. So we're going to poll the audience to begin with. How many people are a yes vote on Lochner? All right. How many are a no vote on Lochner? How many just are indifferent because you don't remember what the hell? Anyway, it sort of split a little bit. I thought it may be more overwhelming than it has been. But I think it's actually been a debate a little bit in the National Federalist Society, sort of the idea of Lochner and the idea of judicial restraint back and forth, what that actually means. And I think in interesting ways, it maybe divides conservatives a little bit from libertarians and lawyers a little bit from non-lawyers. So if you were to take Mike Lee, Ted Cruz, and myself, you say, they're pretty conservative, they're pretty far out there on the right wing. But you ask them about Lochner, and we actually disagree, because I'm a yes on Lochner, and they're both no's on Lochner. Because they're a little bit more in the camp of absolutely we just shouldn't interfere, with the states. We should sort of presume the right of them to act on their own, and judges shouldn't be legislators, et cetera. It also gets back to this fundamental question of what the presumption should be. And I think this is an important philosophical discussion. Should we presume constitutionality, or should we presume liberty? And Randy Barnett's talked about this some, others have talked about this some, but just the question of what the presumption is. And you say, well, it doesn't really mean much, right? Who cares whether it's constitutionality or liberty? What does that actually mean? Well, it becomes a big deal in some cases. So with Lochner, and you're talking about extended hours for bakers, should you sort of presume that it's constitutional unless it's flagrantly not? Is there any kind of presumption of a right to contract? Was there a due process argument? So the court decides 5-4 that there is a due process argument that people do have the right to contract with their employer. Contracts have sort of gone out the window since then. You're really not allowed to contract. You're only allowed to contract under certain things that the courts or the governments have said you can as far as your contracts go. But I think it separates libertarians a little bit from conservatives on Lochner. And you say, well, we're Federalists, we're for judicial restraint. Well, if you're a yes in Lochner, is that really restraint, or is that activism? Or as Randy Barnett calls it, judicial engagement. If you plod along to one of the next cases, which has a little bit of a relation to Kentucky, is Buchanan versus Worley. Worley was a Republican, African-American in Louisville, and he challenged a segregation. It was a housing ordinance that said that a black person can't sell to a white person or vice versa. And it gets struck down unanimously, but interestingly, and for those of us who don't necessarily like Oliver Wendell Holmes that much, he had a dissent. He was going to vote no, even on a segregation case, because he so firmly believed that states ought to, the progressive idea, the states were doing progressive things. He was going to leave the states alone, and he was so firmly for judicial restraint. Well, you get to the 1930s, and you have all the cases in the early 30s, and you have the four horsemen, the conservatives, and how are they all voting on the case, on all the cases? Well, they seem to be voting actively to overturn the stuff the federal government's trying to do. So in some ways, you could argue the court of the early 1930s, before FDR finally gets his way and packs it, is sort of a judicially active court. And if you're someone for limited government, I was kind of with the four horsemen. I was with the people trying to overturn big government in the 1930s. You go on to Brown versus the board. We won't ask for a show of hands, but there's not too many people probably who are a no on Brown versus the board. But Brown versus the board, you could also argue, is a bit of judicial activism. But most of us would accept that there is a role for the court in that, and that there was a 14th Amendment issue. You get to Griswold. Does everybody know what Griswold is? So we'll poll the audience again. How many people are a yes in Griswold? How many are a no in Griswold? All right, a lot more no's in Griswold. Many of the people, or at least I think, conservatives who are no's in Griswold are for a variety of reasons. Maybe judicial restraint, maybe that there was a presumption of a new right being created, but also they're no's because they see it as maybe a stepping stone to Roe versus Wade. But to my mind, I think that there is a presumption that you have certain rights that may not be listed. And I think that's one of the most important things about the Ninth Amendment. I had this discussion one time with Scalia, and it was at a cocktail party. I think he was more interested in the party than he was me, but he kind of blew me off because I kind of said, you're not supposed to disparage. Those rights not listed are not to be disparaged. And he was like, who's doing that and this and that? But that's the whole point. You have a right to privacy. I say, absolutely you do. Do you have a right to private property? Absolutely. Those rights not listed are not to be disparaged. The only way we got the Bill of Rights, the only way you could actually get it through is people were worried that it was going to be a complete listing of rights, and they said, it's better not to list any of them at all, lest people think that this is a complete listing of your rights. They put in the 9th and 10th Amendment. Very important and mostly ignored. Powers not given are reserved to the states and people, but rights not listed are not to be disparaged. You have a whole, panoply, insurance, but you have a whole bunch of rights, basically, that are out there that I think are yours and guaranteed by the Constitution. They don't have to be specifically limited. This becomes important when you get to the 4th Amendment, too, whether things are explicitly, whether you have a right to privacy. And I think there's going to be, if we can ever get some court cases on the 4th Amendment, I think there's the potential that we can get some real big changes. There are people on the left and the right that seem to be in favor of some of these changes. Sotomayor and others have said that the digital era has sort of changed things. And when you think about it, you think about the Constitution and the 4th Amendment and the way it was written was so awesome, but it still does sort of apply today. Back then it was papers, and people didn't want to come to your house because that was your privacy, that was your papers. Now if I ask any of you, which would you rather me do? Have the password to your phone or come in your house and look at your papers? You'd probably rather let me come in your house, to tell you the truth. You probably may not want either one, which is what you should argue for, but the interesting thing is your phone is such a powerful tool that's so full of information that the government should have no right to look at your phone. One of the things that's coming up in legislation that we're going to fight is on Section 702, which has to do with how we gather information from foreigners, supposedly foreigners. But one of the things we've learned in the last couple of months and that I've challenged former Secretary Kelley, who's now the White House Chief of Staff, on is whether or not when you return to your country you should have to divulge your password. They're actually literally detaining people at the border and saying, basically denying entry or promising you detention if you do not give up your password. I really think they ought to have a warrant for that. And I also think that there may be a distinction, and this is a little bit more of a detailed argument, there may be a distinction whether you're a citizen or non-citizen. In the country, the Constitution usually refers to person, so we're all sort of included under it. When you're coming into the country, I kind of tend to think you don't have necessarily all the rights of those who live in the country. But if you're a green card holder or a citizen and you're coming back to your country, I don't think you should be denied entry in your country simply if you won't give up your password. So I think there is some question on whether or not, what the philosophy should be. But when we finally get to Obamacare, the biggest case, at least from my perspective, of the last several years, you finally get to this, I think, really convoluted, bizarre, distorted notion of judicial philosophy as put forward by the Chief Justice. He says if you can imagine somehow that this is a tax, you must. If you can imagine somehow that it's constitutional, we must. Even if the government argued that it wasn't a tax, it was a regulation, or that it was a tax and not the regulation, it's immaterial what the government argued. If you can imagine that it's constitutional, you must. And I think it's an important debate. Napolitano writes about this some too, and talks about basically what others have talked about, presumption of liberty or presumption of constitutionality. And I think it's an important debate. Is there a role for an activist federal judiciary to overturn things that state legislatures do that take away rights? Well, if you have an expansive notion that all the rights aren't listed in the Constitution, that you do have a right to privacy, you do have a right to property, you do have a right to contract, that the privileges and immunities clause of the 14th Amendment means something, you could argue that maybe we would want a Supreme Court that actually does overturn laws. I think we went, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think we went from like the 1930s all the way to the 1990s without ever sort of having any limits on the Interstate Commerce Clause. We basically said you could do anything you want, and then I think there was somebody helped me, what was the case in the 90s? There was a case in the early 90s where we started, Lopez maybe? But we started doing some of it, and that was with Scalia and other conservatives coming together and saying that we're going to it. But we went a long time, and government grew by leaps and bounds. And I think sometimes we, particularly the idea that we don't want justices to be legislators, it sounds really good, and we want justices somehow to be voting on a higher plane, and I know people even get offended by the idea that they're voting on the cases, but that's really what we're having. And I think everybody says, oh, I'm going to obey judicial restraint, I'm going to obey precedent. until you get the lifetime appointment, then you can do what you want. And it's become sort of a, I guess, a way of, it's sort of an art form as far as how you get through the Senate confirmation. You have to say absolutely nothing, and you have to say absolutely, I will follow the rule of the law and precedent, and then when you're on there, then you can do whatever the hell you want. But I think it's an important debate to have. With that, that's my lecture on judicial restraint and versus judicial activism.